same way with a bite. I would take a turn around it and take a bite, passing it through there, tie dress, and set. Now when the climber would get this up in the tree, all they would need to do is pull on this free end, and it's free, ready to go to work. Let's take a look at another very multifunctional knot, the prusik hitch. Not only is the prusik hitch widely used in climbing systems, but it can be used in rigging as well. Here I've got a short endless loop, or a prusik loop. I can fasten this to the standing part of this line by passing it around the standing part and passing one bite around through the other bite, and then doing that a second time. I can dress the knot and set it, and here I've fashioned a 2-wrap 4-coil prusik. Note that I can pull down on it and it'll grab, and I can also pull on it up and it'll also grab. So it's multi-directional. Now, I can also form a prusik hitch in the line with an I&I construction, as I have here. This is a piece of material called Tech 12. It's made out of 100% Technora, which is extremely strong. This 3/8 inch Technora has a breaking strength of about 18,000 pounds. So not only is it strong, but it's also supple, so it'll grab well. I can, again, pass this around the standing part of the line once, twice, and here I've got a 2-wrap 4-coil prusik. If I needed a little bit of extra grab, I can pass it around a 3rd time, and that gives me a 3-wrap 6-coil prusik. Again, note how I can slide it easily, but when I want, it'll grab. I can slide it down, and it'll grab going this way. One way that this hitch can be used in rigging is for a balancing situation, where I may have a long limb that I want to balance, which would reduce the shock load, and I don't want to allow the tip to drop down, so I can fashion a line from one end of the limb to the other and put the prusik midline and adjust it to that good balance point that I can find, attach the steel carabiner onto the rigging line, and away I go. Now let's take another look at a way that I can use a prusik hitch. Here I've got a 3/8 inch 10X splice die rigging sling. Notice how large the eye splice is. I might utilize this in the spider balancer situation. And I may even want to use more than one, depending on the limb that I want to balance. I can simply take this large eye and pass this other end. This one here is a little bit long, but I can pass this through the eye, much as I've done with the other one. Once, twice, 3 times through. And again, I can dress the knot. Again, we can see that I've attached a prusik hitch here onto the rigging line, and this could be very useful indeed. So those are a couple of different ways that we can use the prusik hitch to our advantage in rigging situations. I want to show you a knot that I'll use while rigging for mechanical advantage. And it can actually be used in a number of different situations where I want to grab a hold of the rope without tying a knot into the line. And this is actually a variation of the French prusik. Notice how it spreads out in some ways similarly to a splice or a berry splice, in that the friction is spread out over kind of a wide area, especially in comparison to other prusiks or other methods. And that will cinch down tight. I can use as many turns and as many crosses here as need be. One of the really nice features of attaching to the rigging line in this fashion is that I can move it. When I slack it off, I can move it in either direction. That can be real handy, especially in some situations. Now, when I tie this variation of the French prusik with an I&I splice, we call this a val de temps tresse, or a VT for short. Now, whenever we're using a prusik
whether it's a val de temps or a 3-wrap pressic in this case on a working line, any type of pressic, and for that matter, any type of a friction hitch that we're using to apply to another line so that it will work. There are some things we need to think through. For example, the diameter. In most cases, we need to go to a smaller diameter cord for the pressic itself. Both of these are slightly smaller in diameter, and because they're both a little bit more supple, that will also help in the grabbing. You have to always pay attention to and be sure that what you're taking and forming a pressic with, and then you apply it to a working line, that they work together in a desirable fashion. Do not take for granted that just because you tie the knot properly, if the ropes are not working together properly, then it will not function properly. So pay close attention to your diameter and the gripping power and the ability of the ropes to work together.
Let's take a look at a way to form a loop in the standing part of the line. We're going to be looking here at the butterfly knot. And there are two ways to tie the butterfly. I can start, one technique is to start with a round turn on my hand. I can take the turn closest to me, pass it over between the other two turns, now take the turn that is now closest to me, pass it over both, and then back through the middle. Pulling on both ends, I can set the knot, and we now have a butterfly knot. Some people like to use this as a loop in the standing part, and it is nice because it's multi-directional. I can pull on it both ways. You can see it's very symmetrical. However, I do need to be careful. If I put too much tension on the line, it could bind up hard, and it would be hard for me to break the knot. Since I haven't over-tensioned this, though, it is fairly easy to break by breaking these two bars, and then you can see that it easily comes undone. Now, another way to form the butterfly knot is to start with a bight of rope in the standing part, and then I'm going to turn that bight 180, 360 degrees. Now I have two loops. I'll take the bight, pass it over the back, and then through the middle loop. And again, I can dress the knot and set it, and again I've tied the butterfly knot. So there is sometimes more than one way to skin a cat, and here we've seen how two ways to tie the butterfly knot.
Here's a real handy technique that utilizes the butterfly knot. Let's say that we have removed all the limbs and the top from a tree and we're on the final stem ready for descent. I've taken my climbing line, making sure that both ends are touching the ground. Then I've taken a standing part around the tree. I've clipped a carabiner into the butterfly knot and then onto the standing part. It acts much like a running bowline would without having to pull a long tail through the bowline in order to get it to reach the ground. This end must reach the ground, both parts. Now we want to make sure that the spine is against the tree. We don't want to be bending the carabiner. So on a smaller stem, a quick link, a steel quick link, might be a better choice here for a connecting link. I've got Blake's hitch on the climbing line here, and I've also got a friction device. Now I'll be able to descend from the tree on this part of the line, and then once I reach the ground and I take my climbing hitch off and my figure eight, I can pull this end of the line in order to retrieve my climbing line. Great technique.
In certain rigging situations, we may need to attach two lines together and put them under a lot of heavy strain. Unfortunately, oftentimes when we do this, we may end up with a knife knot or a hatchet knot because you can't undo it. The Zeppelin bend is a good choice that we can use so that we don't end up with a knife knot. I've got two different lines here. Note that I'm going to start with a loop in the end of each line, working ends on the top, ends facing one another. I'll take the blue line, flip it over, and then take the orange line and put this loop on top of the blue one. Now the blue line, the working end is on the bottom. I'll pass that over and down through the two loops, And the orange line is on the top, the working end is on the top, and I'll pass that under and up through the 2 loops. Simply pull on the 2 ends and then set the knot, dress it, and set it, and now I have the Zeppelin bend. And this is very nice, it's very symmetrical. I can pull on it either way, and even after I've put it under a heavy load, it will break open fairly easily by just breaking these bars, and then it can undo itself nicely. So the Zeppelin bend is a good option if we need to attach 2 lines together and put them under heavy strain.
I want to show you a couple of knots that we use for attaching hardware to the tree and using a sling, whether it's for an anchor sling at the base of the tree or for a block up in the tree. There are a couple of knots that we want to be familiar with. But I want to start with just looking at the girth hitch here in the porter wrap. Because I have this large eye, I don't need to have an extra piece of hardware connecting link in between the porter wrap and the sling. Now, let's start with the cow hitch. I'll pass around the tree, and because I have a large eye here in the sling, notice that I've formed a bite around 2 parts, or actually around the eye of the sling, and I passed underneath, and that helps hold the sling and the porter wrap into position. The same would be true up in the tree with a rigging block. Then I change direction and I come back around the tree, and then I'll pass back through the bite. Back through the bite. Now, this is actually similar to a girth hitch or a sling hitch, but I have this open tail and I need to finish. And I'll finish with a better half by passing around the throat, which is the section of the sling between the hardware and the bite, 1/2 hitch. Now, it's better if my tail is going against the bite here, because you'll notice that I've got some extra sling, and I want to put that out of the way because I don't want a tail hanging down here around running rigging. So because I had this much length, I've just gone around the tree with another 1/2 hitch, and I'll tuck the tail out of the way. If my tail was just a little bit shorter, let's say I had a 1-foot tail, for example, here, I would just tuck it underneath. If I had just a few inches and not enough to tuck it, the cow hitch would still be complete. But I want to have at least 5 inches, 4 to 5 inches of tail here, and everything tightened down. In most cases, the throat that I referred to, which is the section between the hardware and the bite of the cow hitch, in many cases you want to keep it short. There are some situations that it might be left longer, but usually it's kept short and tight. Now let's look at what we'll do if I have a shorter sling or bigger wood. And let's start by girth hitching the sling to the porter wrap. I simply pass the end through the eye of the sling and I have my girth hitch. This time I'll be tying a timber hitch. I start by passing the sling around the tree, and then I'll bring the hardware, in this case the porter wrap, up tight. Again, I'm keeping the throat, which is this, again, the section of the sling between the bite in the timber hitch and the hardware. I want to keep it short. That'll help minimize flopping and make the porter wrap easier to work with. Now, I'll begin by tucking the tail of the sling under the standing part on the tree. Once, twice, thrice, and in fact, I'll want at least 5 tucks here. And if I cannot
achieve 5 tucks, either because I don't have a long enough sling or the wood's too big, then I'll need a longer sling. Minimum of 5 tucks. Now the timber hitch has received a bad name in some cases where it's used improperly. It's very important that we spread the tucks out around the tree. Do not make the mistake of letting those tucks bunch up, because if we do, then each one defeats each other by removing friction from the next. So be sure to spread them out, and if we have a real rough bark or perhaps a root flare, we want to make sure that each one of those 5 tucks is in contact with the tree. Now, with both the timber hitch and the cow hitch that we looked at earlier, we want to stop and think a moment about which direction we're going to be loading the hardware. In this case, if we're going to be loading it up, this is good. If we're going to be loading it down, this is good. If we're going to be loading it against the bite, that'll work as well, and that's also proper. What we want to stay away from is loading away from the bite, because the sling can turn. So take a moment, whether we're using the cow hitch or the timber hitch, think through how we're going to be using it, which direction it's going to be pulled in as we load it, and make sure we're loading it either up or down or against the bite or out away from the tree. Let's look at another little trick. This sling is a little bit long for me to be carrying around and storing. Again, using slip knots, I form a loop and I pass a bite through that loop, and then another bite and another bite, and again, depending on the length of my sling, and then I pass the end through, and that's going to be a lot easier to handle. We refer to this as a daisy chain. When I want to use the sling again, I pull the end out and I simply pull the slip knots out, and it's ready to use.
You know, Ken, when I started in tree work, I really only knew a handful of knots and used them for a wide variety of applications. As I've learned more knots over the years, I've really found that one might be a better choice than another, depending on the given situation.
So the more familiar we are with the knots that are commonly used and the ones that are accepted and that we do have good information on that serve well,